My name is Amanda Steinball, and I'm the facilitator for these trainings. As a reminder, the trainings that we offer through Bytes are designed to give targeted training to the faculty and staff of Neosho so that we can better reach our students in various ways. So today I have Kyle Bures, the Director of Teaching and Learning, the TLC Center in Ottawa. He's going to be presenting on distance advising, which I'm very excited about, and I'm glad everybody's here to join us. And Kyle, thank you again for presenting today, and take it away.
All right, thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody who's here today. I guess I'll kind of start with an overview of what I'm going to cover and why I'm interested in this topic with my role with the college over the last couple of years, and then also with the increase in online enrollment and distance learners in general. I've just been more interested in this topic and finding better ways to maybe reach out to our students from the advising perspective. So today is just going to be kind of a brief overview of some comments in the literature in this area, some look into some institutional uses both at Neosho County and some of our neighbor institutions, and then hopefully some discussion regarding best practices. And so there are a couple points throughout the presentation where I'll stop and take questions or suggestions. So please be prepared to help with that. All right, so really before we jump in though, I have a couple of more broad questions that I think help us start to understand what distance advising is. So first of all, what do our distance students look like? I think a lot of times the first thing that pops in our head is proximity to campus. So we tend to think of these students as completely online, but that's not necessarily true. We do have some of our regionally based students who are maybe just trying to minimize or reduce their need to come to campus as much for a variety of reasons, but it is global as well. I can think of a personal example of a student who I'll see about once or twice a year for enrollment or for a quick question, but other than that, they're often deployed and taking classes overseas, and so they're really limited in terms of what type of communication they can use, how often they may be available to communicate, and a variety of other things that limit our correspondence sometimes. The distance learners as a group are pretty heterogeneous by comparison to some of our other student populations like student athletes or first generation students might be, but they do have some common characteristics. They're often attending part-time but working full-time. You can kind of see that illustrated in a recent snapshot of our enrollment data from about 2 weeks ago, that our online campus by head count actually has more students, but by credit hour total is a little bit behind what our physical campuses are. So indicating that a lot of those students are part-time, but they can be residential full-time students too, who are just taking distance courses for flexibility, again, for a variety of reasons. The thing that I found most interesting with the literature review was that many self-report a low to moderate degree of tech ability, which is kind of counter to what you would think with distance learners. But often in my experience, they tend to see that tech obstacle as not as insurmountable maybe as rearranging their life to accommodate a class schedule. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But they're often impacted by situational factors because they're needing the distance learning for flexibility. So they often are working around family obligations and employment obligations that maybe what you think of your traditional on-campus student might not be confronted with as much. But all students also have life circumstances that can come up as well. So in NACADA, which is our global organization or membership for academic advisors, set out to define distance advising almost 2 decades ago now. They started out, the first part of the definition really is common to what you would think of if you were trying to just define advising in general. So I don't think any advisor is going to argue that we're here to assist our students in achieving their maximum educational potential. But the second part of the definition really drives home the difference between distance advising and face-to-face advising, I think, which is to respond to the learner's needs rather than kind of force that cookie cutter approach that we would have maybe for our traditional students. So a recent article in the Chronicle for Higher Education stated that email still remains most colleges' default method of communication. A lot of us in higher ed will often joke that students don't read their emails anyway, but to a point we may be doing this to ourselves. One point that they made in the article was that a lot of those, if you put yourself in the student shoes, a lot of those emails that are found in their inboxes are either very general or maybe not even relevant to that student at all. So it does speak towards the importance for personalizing that form of communication. Moltari reminds us that we need to keep the human contact as a central ingredient in our advising experience. And then Pentland also takes that a step further and says that nonverbal communication is also a central ingredient and something that can be lost as soon as we move to email only or even a phone call. Sometimes it's difficult to detect some of those nonverbal cues. So again, the importance of trying to replicate that face-to-face academic advising as much as possible. I think one of my favorite statements in the literature review was from Gordon, who says, if academic advisors want to reach their advisees and their advisees are living in a digital world, then advisors really need to become part of that world as well. So not necessarily experts, I don't think is the goal in that, but comfortable and willing. And then today's students, we have to remember, are not always able to meet face-to-face for a variety of reasons, especially distance learners. But that doesn't mean that we should limit their access to the same advising resources. And a couple more here. So students who are learning in the online format are kind of playing with the deck stacked against them. They're already at a higher risk for attrition as compared to the campus-based population. And again, just a reminder too that online students can further benefit from that positive supportive relationship in academic advising. Okay, so just some baseline strategies for distance advising that Varney wrote about in 2009. One is to just build relationships with students and keeping in mind wherever they are. So meeting the students halfway, so to speak. Remembering that their schedules may not always be that Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, or may not always be able to travel to campus, or may not always have that as their preferred method of communication. Also recommended having the advisor-advisee contact as part of the admissions process or as early as possible once the student has been admitted. There are really a couple of great programs in our state, most recently with K-State and their Direct Link program, where we're trying to kind of build that dual advising setup before a student even steps foot on that next campus, so that they do see that advisor as that person with the institution that can help them. Also ending correspondence with an offer to use other communication if that's more convenient. Oftentimes, depending on the situation, it may be more convenient to switch from email to a phone conversation or vice versa, or to try to arrange some sort of in-person meeting or a video conference. So just kind of closing with, is this the most convenient form, or does this form of communication, is it most relevant for this situation? Also having a comprehensive orientation as much as possible, and achieving that through video explanations and tutorials if you can. identifying at-risk students. I'll talk a little bit later here about the early alert system that we use at Neosho. But anything that you can do to try to identify and help a student and be proactive in that, to have those interventions as early as possible. Also making online tutoring or resources available to those distance students, and then again being proactive as much as you can. So I looked around at a couple of our neighbor institutions. The first, this information was just taken from their distance advising webpage on Johnson County Community College's website. And they have email to a general advising email for any of their distance students. And then they also have set up instant messaging during certain hours of the day and certain days of the week. And then phone advising by appointment. I was able to reach out to a couple of advisors through K-State University's global campus, and they were able to provide some helpful information on what they do. They've developed a pretty comprehensive timeline for mass messaging, but with those mass message, that campaign, they adapt those to each advisor's personal voice so that the information is the same that's going out to all students, but it's presented in a way that fits that advisor's personality or is personalized to that student. They also use multiple modalities, so they'll use text, phone calls, and email. And again, a lot of times it's depending on context on which they'll choose. But most of their messages also include a call to action, so an invitation at the end of that communication to either schedule via phone or Zoom. But they found that still 80% of the time email tends to be the preferred method of communication for their students. They are a Zoom school, which is what made me think of them to reach out to them to begin with. And they've been using it for about the same time period, I think, that Neosho has for a few years. And it's been available to students, but really still the preferred method again is email. They have had a few that have utilized that though. So Neosho really is similar in its approach to the two institutions that we've talked about here. We have an email that's available, a general email for students to reach who are maybe non-degree seeking or distance students or brand new students to the institution, wanting to know where they go next to get help. We'll also arrange phone conferences, usually by appointment if it's an initial enrollment rather than a quick question. We do have Zoom as an option. And then the early academic warning is run usually 3 times each semester to identify students who are currently at a D or below in classes, and then trying to contact them through phone calls, emails, and in-person appointments to connect with them with resources. But these are just a few of the personal examples where I've found Zoom useful in my advising experience. A lot of times I'll arrange a Zoom appointment with a student who I probably would have met with in person anyway, but due to travel or time restrictions for that particular period of time, Zoom was an attractive option for them because it again replicated that face-to-face interaction as much as possible. I've also used it to troubleshoot enrollment. So in a case where maybe I've granted student a clearance to enroll, we've met already and they're making changes to their schedule, but having trouble navigating either my Neosho or had questions about different options for courses, we'll use Zoom so that we can screen share back and forth and get a visual context there. Also, if it's a degree progress question and they want to set up an appointment by phone, I'll recommend Zoom just again for that screen sharing option so that they can get a visual and understand better what I'm talking about if I'm explaining a screen or a requirement. And then out-of-state transfers. So these are students who have declared they're coming to Neosho, but maybe aren't actually going to be on campus or available to come to campus right up until the start date. So Zoom is usually an attractive option to those students who would have preferred that face-to-face communication as well. So these are just a couple of suggestions or ideas for application on how you could use Zoom in an advising scenario. The most obvious one is one-to-one. So again, if you have a student who would prefer that face-to-face, Zoom is going to most closely replicate that. Group advising is another example. In our advisor certification class this spring, one of our students, Jackie Bennett, did her final literature review on a concept called speed advising, which is based from I believe it was a medical school who would compose 20 to 40-minute sessions with a small group or medium-sized group of students who all needed the same help or had the same questions or for enrollment. So not speed advising in the sense that you're trying to rush through students as fast as possible, but if they have a common group of questions or needs, then it might make sense to arrange sessions that way. A couple of examples that quickly came to mind for me are the nursing information meetings, something that could potentially be made available in this format, or if it's a program student where that enrollment is more prescribed in nature and they're just kind of needing help navigating the portal or something like that. Also, you could schedule brief sessions on general topics and then make those available and record them or send those to those who aren't able to attend. So I think this would make sense a lot of times. And if you just had general enrollment guidelines at the beginning of the semester, or if you're working with a specific population, so maybe those students who are needing to apply for graduation by the end of the semester, holding a few sessions on Zoom that way and then sending that link out or that video out to those who couldn't attend that. And then again, just some common troubleshooting scenarios where maybe walking through course search or a degree audit on my Neosho or giving control for items like a personal information update. So these are based on personal experience using Zoom for advising. Quiz 1 is multiple selection, so I'll take any guesses or responses at this point. Anybody care to venture a guess?
All of the above.
Fortunately, it is not all of the above. It is only A and C, but B is often on my mind as I start to connect. So hopefully it remains A and C. Quiz 2. Now you're only choosing one here, so if anybody cares to have a guess at that. The answer is D. So just about anywhere except for what you would maybe hope for. Not had any that were too distracting, but it does kind of to speak to where we're going next, which is some best practices on maybe how to inform students on using Zoom before you make that first connection. So again, these are just based on my personal experience using Zoom. I've been using it for, I'd say, about 1 to 2 years, but just in the last semester have used it a lot more frequently than in that first year and a half. And I think it's just a matter of identifying when it makes sense rather than trying to push it as a general way to do advising. But one thing that I usually do is I'll include instructions when I send out my correspondence at the beginning of each enrollment period, just making them aware that it's available. Again, it's not widespread buy-in on that, but there's usually 1 or 2 that will respond and say, it's difficult for me to get to campus, but I would prefer to do it this way. So it's helpful to include that in that correspondence. I'll usually try to give them just some very basic background info that it doesn't cost anything. It's easy to set up. Maybe some quick tech requirements if they have questions about that. And one thing that I, based on the previous quiz questions, will probably start to do more of is encourage them to treat it more like an appointment where they were meeting on campus face to face. So just a matter of being on time, prepared, free of distractions, but also making them aware that they can access that link early to kind of test the technology, so that they're not joining late due to tech issues or troubleshooting. And then I usually will try to grab a good contact number for the student just in case there are technical issues on either end. That way it's just not a complete drop in communication. And they'll know that I'll reach out to them, and we can still try to do what we can by phone. So I think a couple of the main takeaways for me, I go back to that earlier statement from Gordon where, again, if our advisees or our students in general are living in a digital world, then we need to at least become part of that world as users, not necessarily experts, but having the comfort level with navigating that and making it available. In that same breath, I think that it's important to remember that we shouldn't necessarily pressure them to meet in this format if they're unfamiliar or uncomfortable doing so. So if they do prefer still email, or maybe phone is more convenient to them, not necessarily pushing a video conference or a Zoom session, but be aware of it again as an option and make it available to those students, and just being creative in how technology like this can support or enhance your current advising approach and not use it to create a barrier. So there are these are the links and references to the full articles. So if you do want to read further into any of the earlier Lit Review quotes, you're welcome to do that. And I also want to thank again the KSU Global Campus and Johnson County for providing information for this as well.
Al, thank you so much for teaching us today. I took a lot of notes, so it's going to be very useful. So I appreciate that. And everyone, thank you for logging on today, and just look forward to next month's Lunch Bytes email coming from Marie. I believe it is going to be an early bird session on my Neosho. So I appreciate everybody joining us. Have a great day, and we'll see you later.